Good morning, everybody who's on. Welcome to the Takedown with Nick, Subverting Power with Radical Thought. I'm actually glad to have a special guest this morning that I thought I want to reach out to and speak to. And I'm going to let Alex actually introduce herself and, basically tell you guys about us. But before that, I'd like to thank you guys for spending this time with us. Time is something that we never get back. So I just want to start off with that. I usually do it, early on in the show, and I want to thank you guys. And let's get the conversation started. Alex, why don't you introduce yourself to our guests? Our audience.
No problem. Hi, everybody. I'm Alex Press. I'm an independent writer and PhD student in sociology based in Boston. I write for Jacobin, The Nation, a few other places, and run a blog as well. And Nick asked me on after writing a recent piece about sort of the Democratic donor elite. So, pleasure to be here.
Why don't you go ahead and I am not a fan of the Democratic Party, and I guess my audience by now fully understands, my politics on them, particularly. But why don't you explain? Kind of take us through a summary of that piece and of what you feel and where your analysis as far as them is concerned.
Sure. So in my understanding of the Democratic Party, they are sort of the slightly better of the two capitalist parties. So I think particularly in this recent election, there's a lot of anger at them for running such a wildly unpopular candidate. Sort of an incredibly out of touch strategy that ignored kind of real hurt that a lot of people were feeling. So this piece is sort of about their donors, particularly David Brock, who is a kind of infamous character. He used to be a right winger, and he wrote he wrote lots of kind of Bill Clinton. He wrote about Bill Clinton's sexual harassment scandals, and then he switched his politics and became Hillary Clinton's kind of attack dog. So it's about how this article is about how a couple days after the election, in the midst of, a failed strategy, instead of taking time out to reflect on how badly they'd messed up, David Brock and his sort of class of donors all said, let's have a retreat. Let's plan how to, defeat Trump in the next election. Sort of said, let's do the same thing yet again. So my piece is about how, closed the thinking is of this kind of Democratic Party elite and how little they have to offer working class people when it comes to actually defeating Trump. And so it's, I'm a socialist. It lays out a very straightforward kind of socialist program of building power from the bottom and kind of advocating policies, much of what Sanders advocated. The Democratic Party, yet again, can't offer us anything we don't already have, which is our own strength. So that's pretty much my view of the Democratic Party. And of course, I'm as mad as everybody else about their failure this time around.
That's an interesting, everybody keeps saying, they haven't learned anything and things of that nature. But my question is it even possible for them to learn something with the way the party is structured and who it primarily serves? I don't think that it's going to be able to have this, aha moment. I think basically the best that they can do is continue to do the exact same thing, but maybe put up a better show.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that's something that, a lot of people are maybe coming to that conclusion now. And so the piece itself is, sort of says these elites, the rich in general, can't save us in that. That's who the Democratic Party ultimately is kind of, too reliant on. Those are the only kind of people they can listen to. So I quite agree with you. But then the question becomes, so what do we do? Right. That's how these conversations always go.
But I think before we ask what we do, it's kind of important that we all are on the same page about what the problem is. And I think that in many ways we're still not quite there. And we identify maybe a few things, but I oftentimes hear that okay, well, Nick, you're being too purist. If you try to do like a purity politics, then you won't have any elected officials and you won't have anything ever. And I'm always saying, well, if you don't actually draw hard lines, like they just do whatever and you have no control over them. Where do you think the actual balance comes from? Like, where do you think that there's an actual balance there? Or do you even think that's a valid critique?
I think it makes sense people think that way because we understand power as solely having elected officials. My understanding, though, is a little bit different. I think power comes just as much from kind of broadening political space outside of elected officials, sort of putting force through movements to actually say, like, demand certain really progressive and radical reforms. And if you build a strong movement, oftentimes officials that were in no way really progressive in any sense, regular centerline Democrats will still end up passing those policies to sort of co-opt a movement. So to me, it's not an either or. You can sort of work outside of the party and still have that kind of electoral impact in the end. But that's an understanding that I think a lot of people, we don't see power as coming anywhere except from elected officials. But we actually don't understand what brings them to support progressive policies. So I advocate kind of focusing outside of the party myself. But you have to have that conversation with people for sure.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned power. I'm probably going to do a show on power one of these days. But just to think about it, when we think about our elected officials, I always kind of feel like they're not necessarily they're not really the power, or they're not really the people who are doing things. They're more like an instrument of the real power in our society, and oftentimes that is the people who own the society. They are the power, and the politicians are their instruments, right? So when you say that we misunderstand power and that we assume that the politician agrees with us or is on our side, when they implement policies, I think you're kind of hitting kind of along those same lines there, because everybody believes that, when a politician agrees with you, they pass your policy. And I think that that's the common understanding of how it works. And I think that's totally wrong. It's completely, it doesn't even have empirical evidence to back it up. It's just kind of like a lazy analysis. And I think we're kind of suffering from that.
Sure.
How would you say that? What would you say is an instance in history where that kind of model has actually come to fruition?
Where a politician agreed with sort
of
no.
Where like you have a broad movement of people, and a politician who wouldn't have done something was forced to do something. Can you name some instances?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple arrows that are like really illustrative for this. So first of all, we have kind of what we think of as FDR's big policy. He kind of like the New Deal, he working people back to work. But he also was dealing with an incredibly militant mass labor movement at the time. Is one instance where if you look at what the unions were advocating, it was actually even more radical than what FDR ultimately passed. But because they were demanding, almost socialism in many senses of that term, FDR he sort of understood what would happen if he didn't pass progressive policy, and he came up with the New Deal as a sort of compromise measure. So this is something we look back on and say, like, this is one of the greatest, policies that the United States ever passed. And yet it actually was, a compromise measure in the face of a militant movement. And I think you can find similar instances around the civil rights movement, whether it's the Voting Rights Act. And we have kind of the president sitting down with Martin Luther King and saying, look, I'll pass this if you can control your movement and you can, sort of act as a measure to the more radical demands. So that's how I sort of see this dynamic always working. But I think those two eras are when we really had strong mass movements. So you also see these examples then.
Now, today there's definitely a parallel, between some of those eras, but they're lacking that word that you use, that word that you use that I've used that before when I was talking to another person that's trying to expand the labor union activity and the labor movement in general. And that word is militancy. And I think that that's critical. And I think the militancy, the or else, the no, we're not gonna take anything but what we're asking for. I think that that's critical in attaining your political goals. Sure. I've watched throughout countless, political battles. It seems like the side that's willing to say, no, I'm only going to accept exactly what I want. Usually that side is able to win. But in America, for some reason, the common liberal train of thought is, we should be reasonable and compromise with the other side. And I believe that's almost like a faulty political philosophy. It's almost self-defeating if you're trying to achieve goals that way. But can you speak about what exactly the militancy is?
Yeah, I mean, well, you used a common word, a good word yourself there, and that's the liberal understanding in America of, how we make kind of how we achieve policies through compromise. If you notice, though, in America, certainly the right does exactly what you've noticed, which is militantly demands exactly what they want. And what we see in this country is, in institutional politics, a huge shift to the right. Sort of Tea Party, what would have been fringe is now normal and mainstream. And that comes from demanding exactly what they want, unfortunately. So I think the left could certainly learn from that, as weird as it is to say, but that sort of the art of politics is winning what you're demanding and getting the other side to come to you. So, I mean, militancy in movements, there's always a militant wing, but I think liberal understanding of sort of compromise and negotiation has definitely infected a lot of movements in a way where this sense of respectability politics, or whatever you want to call it, comes to the fore, and movements kind of water themselves down in a sense. So I think it's really important to revive that history of, what actually won us gains in the past. And it was this kind of radical willingness to demand what we need to live.
That is, yeah. I mean, I'm glad I found somebody that agrees with me. Most people, when I say that and I'm talking about being militant and saying, no, you're going to give me exactly what I want, or else, I'm not going to come along, they say, well, you won't get anything. They're scared almost of being radical and demanding what you want. And if you're passionate about an issue, not willing to give on that issue, they feel like that's like a child throwing a tantrum. But there's a saying, the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right?
Right. I mean, even if who knows how you feel about Bernie Sanders, and whether he was radical enough or not. I mean, but at the end of the day, he stuck to his message entirely. And, the pundits or the elite would have said that his message was too radical for America, that calling yourself a socialist, is a guaranteed way to be isolated in this country. But he proved that's absolutely not true. And that people, millions of people flocked to him for demanding exactly what he wanted and sticking to that message, almost to the point where it was, almost funny how his speech was always the exact same. But I think he showed that works. He didn't win, but he certainly showed how attractive that is.
Well, I actually have a problem with Sanders, and my problem is, and this is my problem with a lot of these so-called progressives and even, the progressive independent media and all of that. It seemed like, when he lost the primary, the first thing that everybody starts to do is they start to unify behind neoliberalism. And I think that that's really problematic. I think that neoliberalism is a huge problem, and we need to get rid of it. But you can't do that if you're always running to it to coalesce behind it because you fear the right.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that when you said finding parallels in the Republican Party, I don't necessarily think that the Republicans actually do that with their candidates all the time. Using the Tea Party as an example, they were willing to lose races. And again, comes back to that militancy. But what do you think about when Sanders, went in a line behind Hillary Clinton?
Well, I mean, I think it sounds like you and I share similar problems with Sanders, which is, I think it can do a lot of damage for somebody like Bernie Sanders to line up behind elites like Hillary Clinton, when millions of young people are looking to him as sort of to set an example of how to actually win. And in my piece, the recent piece for Jacobin, I sort of talk a little bit about this, in that, in my opinion, that sort of neoliberalism, which creates massive inequality, is completely blind to the concerns of, the majority of people in this country. It produces the resentment and the Trumpism or white supremacy or whatever you want to call it. So to see Sanders line up behind it, I think does damage to helping people understand kind of how this dynamic works, and how kind of neoliberalism is the prettier face, is sort of the democratic, diplomatic face of really horrible things, the far right. So, I mean, for Sanders to do that, I think fortunately, a lot of people saw that as a problem and did criticize him for it. But at the end of the day, what you're saying is true about, so-called progressive Democrats is they're going to line up behind the party, and the party's lining up behind the right. So,
now, another thing that I say a lot, I'm just going to stop using oftentimes, but what I also say is that you'll see, individuals that are supposedly progressive, and when I ask them this, they kind of balk at me. They're like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Well, is this person going to put the party first, or are they going to put the needs of their constituents first?" And I think that's a question that we should start asking about our politicians, because it's particularly with the Democratic Party, no matter how progressive an individual member is, when the Democratic Party leans on them, what are they going to do? Are they going to buck the system and rebel, or are they going to bow their head to stay a part of an organization? And I think that that's kind of where Sanders kind of fell in there. Is he going to play nice and get along, or is he going to, basically really take up a militant insurgency and start like a guerrilla warfare kind of campaign? And I think that's where the trying to get along with people kind of comes back and bites us. What do you think?
I mean, I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier in this conversation, which is, at the end of the day, the politician is going to do what they need to do to maintain their membership in the party. And if the party is most responsive to those with power and money, then that's never going to be what folks like us want them to do. So this goes back to sort of how I understand winning, which is forcing those politicians more left-wing stands. And we do that by building mass movements. We can't do it by hoping that a politician like Bernie Sanders is going to start some sort of insurgent campaign against the Democrats from the left. That's for us to do. It'll never be the sort of party member. That's just how they've gotten so far in the party, is by not doing that.
That's an interesting thing. Like kind of like, the people who already align with their viewpoints or align with their way of doing politics sort of rise to the top, as we see with, Chuck Schumer, Hillary Clinton, and Nancy Pelosi. These people kind of, the people who actually move into these power positions sort of rise to the top, but they're already well entrenched and well invested in, and they've been producing for the donor class for quite some time. But here's an interesting question. We keep talking about power and we keep talking about the donor class, but what is their influence? Where does their power come from? What is its expression?
What is the expression power
of their power? Where does it come from? What is it? How do they control the politicians?
I mean, that's there's a lot of ways that happens. I think the most important one is through lobbying and through kind of their role as a representative of big business, whatever that might be. For the Democrats, more and more, it's kind of a high tech sector. In the Republicans, it's the older oil money, gas and energy. That's the sort of high finance. But these donors are, of that milieu. They come from those jobs, and those are their sort of social circles, and they often overlap quite a lot with professional lobbying institutions that are the mediators between big business and politicians. So they fund those campaigns, they fund the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party might say that they're kind of responsible to their constituents like us, but we don't really fund them. They're responsible, for their survival on these donors.
So you used an interesting word. You said fund, and when I think of the word fund, I think of the word money. And so now, we come to the question. I hear a lot of times people will say, well, it's okay if they take corporate money or if they take the lobbyist money, as long as the money doesn't compromise them. What do you think that sounds like?
I mean, that sounds like someone who doesn't know, how these businesses got so rich in the first place, which is good business decisions. I mean, they wouldn't be offering this much money to politicians if they didn't know that they got real results from that. And so no good businessman is going to offer millions of dollars to candidates unless he knew that this had an impact on their actual policies. And I think we can see with almost every, there's an example from every bill of which politicians supported that, what money they took. Fortunately, a lot of this stuff is now public record, where we can follow the money quite explicitly. So I think that, I wish that were true, but it's definitely not true. That money has no influence on policies.
So moving forward, this goes back to the question I asked, before. I was like, hey, purity politics, you'll eliminate all the politicians, you won't end up with anybody. And I think I got hit with this when I said that any candidate that's taking corporate money is already suspect. I mean, do you think that's fair of me to say?
Yeah, sure. I don't see why it wouldn't be suspect to be taking corporate money. And I think, again, like as flawed as he was, Sanders showed that you don't have to take corporate money to be a successful politician. So that excuse is now gone. So you should be suspicious, sure.
See, and I'm glad to hear you say that. I actually didn't know what your answer is going to be. I was just like, well, I don't know. What should I ask her? But a lot of times, you hear things. I hear things, and they're always like, it's almost like, okay, that corporations corrupt our government on one side, and then that they do it through their money and power, so to speak, or money as their power, right? But how is it that all of a sudden that means that it's okay for us to get behind any individual candidate, even when they're taking that money from these corporate interests, because they're not corrupted by it? It's almost as if, we understand one thing here, we understand another thing here, but we're not letting those understandings actually come into our decision making and actually let us follow through some sort of logical strategy. It's almost like an emotional reaction or an emotional decision that has nothing to do with logic. It's like it was almost like a disconnect. Have you seen something like that similar?
Yeah, I mean, I think emotions do matter in politics, and I think it's incredibly upsetting to feel like there's no one that represents you. And so I think a lot of us, try to find someone that represents us as best as we can sort of see it, someone who's the best of the bad choices, maybe. And there's an attachment. I think that's just a human thing to get attached to people who are sort of speaking the right rhetoric and saying they represent you. But on the other hand, half of voters that could have voted stayed home this election. So I think a lot of people really don't have that emotional attachment. They're just giving up, when they see that these candidates are so similar, they just stay home. So I think that's, as indicative of a problem as what you're pointing out.
Yeah. Now we've spoken about there being a lot of movements, a lot of movement activity, a lot of activism going on. But one of the things that I know another guest pointed out was that there's not a lot of how can I say, there's no cohesiveness. It's like almost everybody's siloed on their own thing. All these groups are siloed and they're not necessarily coming together and working together for particular issues. What would you say could be something that people can coalesce around?
So I think, first of all, that it's important to recognize what you just said, and that's very true, that there's all these movements and they're very disconnected, whether it's based on identity category or issue area. I think we have, the environmental movement, we have anti-racist movements, all of these different ones. But, part of what I do in my work is labor organizing. And I think also as a kind of an academic who studies history, I think the labor movement and union organizing has shown to be this coherent identity because I think you said earlier today, everybody works, almost everybody works. And so this is, if you're really looking for a concrete unifier, that's the one.
And it's strange because it seems as though, many of these movements, a lot of times when I speak to them, or I'm speaking to somebody that's a member or somebody that works with them, a lot of times, or maybe not even somebody involved in the movement, somebody that's outside, a lot of times they don't see the connection. Like if I go and speak to someone on the environment and I talk about corporate interests, a lot of times, well, actually, no, that's a bad one. They generally know who they're up against, right? Let's say I'm speaking to somebody that's saying that's concerned about racism or women's rights, and I speak to them about corporate interests or things of that nature. They'll say, well, that really doesn't have an impact on me. That has nothing to do with me. Or I'm speaking to a person that's anti-racist, and they're speaking about and I'm speaking about foreign policy, and they're saying they're not connected. And it's just like we're not recognizing that many of these things come from the same thing, so to speak. And that's why I believe, just as you just said, that labor could be a unifying factor because all people work, and all you have to do is have, basically produce the threat of a good example on one front, and it makes all of the other fronts more powerful. And of course, stronger together, right? They can accomplish more things together than apart. But there are some advantages to being siloed. And I know I'll actually table that. But what do you think about what I just said, where people are feeling disconnected?
I think, one thing that's good about the current era is this term intersectionality, I think really is coming to the fore in how people are understanding movements. So I think more and more in any movement, you will find a wing that gets the connection, between all the issues. And this is this more radical kind of anti-capitalist understanding of how these issues are connected through the exploitation of labor and through kind of capital accumulation, getting rich off of all of us, no matter our identity or where we are in the country. So I think, part of that feeling of disconnection is, comes, I think, as much from how these movements are getting funded as it does from any real denial of the connections. I think that denial is kind of going away. But unfortunately, a lot of movements are kind of reliant on nonprofits, and those nonprofits get funded by having very narrow focus on one issue and having, kind of measurable results is what they call it. So those organizations kind of have an interest in continuing to silo a movement. So fortunately, I think intersectional lenses are kind of forcing a change in that, but maybe that's me being a little too hopeful compared to what you're kind of spelling out.
Well, I mean, now, no offense. I think that I think the only silver lining to everybody being siloed, but kind of like the movement is so distributed, is that it's hard to destroy. So at most point, we see in America that the power structure has made peace, not with the fact that these movements exist, whereas in the past they were marked for destruction, so to speak, or marked for deletion. I like to say that, but we see that they were kind of actively, destroyed. Here, they're more like they're left alone, but they just are basically the system kind of makes sure they're dispersed and that they don't coalesce in anything. It's more interested in doing that than outright destroying them, because you destroy one thing and another one pops up in its place. It's really hard. There's no like one spot where they can just deal a decisive blow and it's all gone. I do believe if there was such a spot, they got rid of it long ago when they destroyed the labor unions.
Sure. And I think if there was kind of a new coalescence around any, one issue or any one movement got too strong, we see those same destructive tendencies come back from the state. So I wouldn't get too kind of like give too much credit to the state for not destroying our movements. I think our movements don't pose enough of a threat right now for that. But there's certainly concerns in the present, especially under the new Trump administration, about surveillance and repression, particularly against anti-racist organizers. I think we shouldn't laugh off the seriousness of what some people are facing when it comes to repression, and specifically, especially surveillance of people's communities.
Now, when I think of that, though, I think back to the Occupy Wall Street movement and how that was destroyed basically by the police, across the nation, almost probably coordinated by the federal government itself. You're right. They will, when a movement starts to rise up that actually starts to coalesce, they will actually, the state will use violence and whatever other tools it has to destroy it. But I think that there's a base level of activism that's just allowed to roam. And that's just maybe because they can't actually destroy it at that level. But you're right. The state will actually come in and use the typical tools to get rid of any movement that gains a lot of power. I will have to concede that. But I was just saying, at least it exists. The movement exists and it is still around. But you're right. It will be destroyed.
Yeah. And I mean, and what you're saying is true. We in this country do enjoy certain things that were, we've won certain freedoms over struggle, over history that don't exist in certain other places in the world. And I don't think, we shouldn't laugh off like that doesn't matter. I mean, that a movement can't exist in the open today is a huge benefit for all of us who are organizers or writers.
I'm gonna change gears here because when I read the article, "The Rich Can't Save Us," there's another article that I remember reading, and it was basically speaking about how the rich were gathering to speak about curing poverty or finding a solution for poverty. And the first thing I did was I laughed, because I was like, well, if you're really concerned about, handling poverty, you would, give up your wealth and influence and, undue privileges that you have from the government. You would give those things up because that is the primary cause of all the poverty that's out there. But I somehow don't think that they're really ready to do that. So what do you think they mean when they get together and they say they want to solve poverty?
Well, I think, it differs, but certainly when rich people talk about curing poverty or solving poverty, first of all, they mean certain categories of poor people, right? Because we know in this country, particularly around race, certain poor people aren't seen as deserving of getting saved, or whatever you want to call this kind of charitable approach to ending poverty. So I think, there's certain issues, like say homeless populations tend to be a group that rich people will say, like, this is something I support fixing because I don't like seeing homeless people, or I feel this is something so awful. If this is a veteran, he doesn't deserve to be homeless. But even in those cases of the so-called kind of deserving poor, it really doesn't follow with any policy measures. It's a lot of good talk, but the homeless population in this country is not going down. So I think this is as much about like assuaging moral guilt on the part of rich people as it is about fixing anything, because you're exactly right. If it was about fixing poverty, then maybe we should redistribute some of that money. But that is absolutely never what they mean by that.
That's actually something I never even thought about it. How we have to break it down to the individual. A lot of times I'll keep it at like the mass level, and I'll look at it and like, well, it's your wealth and your power that causes the poverty. If you're willing to give those up, then maybe we can talk. But as long as you're unwilling to part with those, there's not much we can do here. But you mentioned something that they'll speak about specific classes of people. So they further break it down. So we'll save some poor people. We'll save the veteran. We'll save the rural poor. But we won't do anything about, the basically the most disenfranchised section of the society. And that's mainly, women and minority women and minorities in general. Those poor people, they don't say anything about that. But it really gets to something else I want to talk about where, a lot of times people think that, the world's problems can be solved by charity. Like, and you use that word, you're like, they'll do like a charity or something like that. And I'm like, the world is not structured around charity. If we tried to do things based off of charity, nothing would ever work. So if you're serious about confronting these issues, they have to be solved through deliberate policy where everybody is basically forced to do some action, or society is constructed in such a way that the problem can be addressed.
Yeah. I mean, if we really wanted to solve it, right, we wouldn't have this basic this system of kind of exploitation of the majority so that the money and wealth is redistributed to the top, and if we really, really wanted people to not be poor, we wouldn't support that system. But I think because we do have that system, charity, is dependent on it. It's the idea that there's a few people with so much money that they can kind of donate a few million here and there to help those at the bottom. So charity is predicated on this mass inequality. So I think those of us who have a problem with that inequality absolutely have to say charity is not the solution. We need to redistribute before people are getting that rich in the first place.
What do you think what do you think if you could name 5 policies that would do the most amount of good as far as addressing that issue? What would you say they are?
Well, I think, the sort of snarky one-liners, give money to poor people. So whether that means, providing a universal basic income, whether it's about universal kind of single-payer healthcare, that would be a huge one. Those are 2 huge costs. We could have kind of broader aid to particularly women with dependent children, but that didn't require them to work and didn't have such tight limits for unemployment. I think those are 3. And we can kind of keep going with, just giving money to poor people is proven. I mean, social scientific studies again and again show that this is far more effective than the very complicated kind of wonky policies that we try out. At the end of the day, despite the discourse that if you give money to poor people, they'll waste it, studies don't show that at all. And it's much more effective than, say, better schooling for kids. It's actually, if a kid isn't so poor, they'll do better at school. So I think that's,
if the communities aren't so poor, the school will have resources to properly educate the child. It's complete. I think that's the whole education thing. That's just, a better, like you said earlier, a prettier face on the meritocratic idea, basically. But when I talk to people about what a real meritocracy is, they're not really prepared to actually go into something like that. I was like, well, could you imagine a place where all the kids are educated exactly the same? There are no children that get to go to better schools. There are no poor children that have all these disadvantages. And on the same token, there are no rich or middle class children that have all these advantages. When you die, everything you own goes back to wherever, and everybody starts off with the exact same thing. Is that really a world that you want to live in? And most people will say no. And I was like, well, then you need to abandon this idea that everything that you end up with, everything that you do in your life is all based on your own merit. Right. Yeah. Because really, there's a lot of play in there. Sure. Why don't you talk about what you see as meritocracy's biggest failing? Like, what do you think that produces for us?
You mean the kind of idea that we're a meritocracy?
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
I think, it does exactly what you're talking about, which is has this effect ideologically hiding what's really going on, which is mass inequality. It's sort of the idea that, people who are at the top got there on their own merit, and they're the ones who often control whether it's the media or the politicians or the big business. So of course they're not going to be the ones to say, actually, I had an advantage. You actually see this in a really, obscene way in a recent interview with Ivanka Trump, who says, actually, I had it really hard growing up because I couldn't sell lemonade at a lemonade stand. And she gives this whole anecdote about how, because she lived in Trump Tower or something, her dad wouldn't let her have a lemonade stand. And instead, when she would go to the Hamptons in the summer, she tried to have a lemonade stand, but everyone lives in mansions and no one was walking around. And she basically says at the end of this interview, so actually, I didn't have it any easier than any other kid. So, I mean, if you can have the child of a billionaire kind of saying that she had it even harder than regular kids, you can see just how deep this ideology goes. So I think it really does damage, for a lot of us poorer folks in the opposite direction, in that we blame ourselves in a way that, is really is horrifying, because, I mean, we have a mass, whether it's we talk about opiate addiction, alcoholism, whatever, a lot of this is all tied up in how it feels to live in a society that tells you it's your fault that you're struggling. To me, that is the most tragic side effect of this kind of belief in whether it's the American dream or meritocracy.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of my big things. I can't stand the meritocracy, and every time somebody uses that type of argument, it could be about politics. Well, if they were a better politician, they would have won. And it's like, well, no, sometimes a better politician will still lose. There's outside factors, right? Not everything in this world is decided by who is the best or who does the best or who is the strongest or whatever. Sometimes, people just win or lose and it has nothing to do with them.
And I think, what we're saying in this whole conversation is that it often has to do with who has the money at the start, or who has the power. In this world, power and money are almost the same terms, sadly. But yeah, so I think it's totally a made up ideology.
And that's what I was trying to get at earlier when we were talking about what's their method. And I think it's really the money. Like, I think it's really, the money is their power, and we shouldn't be trying to kind of sort of like get along with a candidate who's under them, so to speak. Like, we would like our candidate to be as responsive to us as possible. And that means, possibly not being okay with the candidate taking corporate money.
Yeah. I think it's important to point out that, there are two kinds of power here, though, really. There's the power that is money, and that comes from that these donors have, but if we want our candidates, or not our candidates, but if we want the candidates to actually be responsive to us, it's important to always keep in mind the power that we have, which is in numbers. At the end of the day, the fact that the majority of us work and are working class or poor, unfortunately, at this point, I think it's important not to just conflate power with money, because power is actually also in our hands as well. And so, if you forget that we have that power in organization to kind of demand change, you can get really, down and nihilistic and feel like there's nothing we can do, which is not where I stand.
Yeah, of course, you're right. Money and power are not always equal. They are not always equal. And I kind of fall victim to almost conflating the two. But yes, there are people who are not necessarily wealthy that wield tons of power. And I think in this case, that money is acting as their vehicle, their method of exchange, so to speak. And that's kind of why I kind of conflate the two. But you're right. They are separate, but they're correlated in our society.
Yeah.
Maybe not all the time. But let me ask you. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, just as a labor organizer, the number one kind of understanding is that our power lies in our labor, in the fact that we can withhold it, and the fact that we are the ones who know how to do our work and not our bosses. And so this, to me, that also is power. And you see it when there's strikes, you see it when there's walkouts, that the entire society or business shuts down. So that's a hugely important lesson for for like my colleagues and fellow workers is, that power is in us as well.
You know what? That is hugely important, and I want everybody to note that this is why one of the first unions to be destroyed would be the unions that have to do with transportation of goods from one place to another. That is always that is probably the most powerful union. The people that work at the shipyards, the ports, trains, trucking, those unions are immensely powerful because without them, none of the goods can actually make it to market. And if that union were to strike, there would be an immediate grinding to a halt of an entire country. And that's why, of course, when it came time to, fight the unions, that was one of the first ones to go. So I think that's what you just said, the ability to withhold labor and what that means, to the donor class or to the capitalist class, that's a huge threat to them. Because like you said, they can't do the work. They don't have the numbers even to do the work, even if they knew how. So, we always have to remember that is very, very powerful. And we have that power. And we need to perhaps understand that we can use it at any moment. And they understand it. That's a huge fear that power is ever wielded against them because they won't be able to win against that. They'll have to give up anything.
Yep, that's exactly right. And I think we do forget that a lot in this country because so much of that history of that shows that power, isn't something that we're taught. You have to kind of seek it out.
Who's gonna actually know to do that without some sort of organization that's grouping together workers from a particular industry that's getting them to align their interests and work together to try to achieve something. If you don't have that coalescing force, it's really hard to achieve something like that because then you're just one guy or you're one group or you're one store and the company is hundreds of stores. So they don't care if one store goes down or if one individual area goes down. They can fire all those people, take the loss from that one store and then get new people in. And it really doesn't mean anything to them. I want to actually ask one more question because we're coming to the end of our time here. And I want to thank you actually for providing your time to us. I know I thank the audience for spending their time with us, but I also want to thank you for spending your time with our audience here.
Of course.
But the last question I want to ask you is, how did you arrive at your politics? Like, I know nobody's born this way or has this way of thinking at birth. You kind of have to travel on a journey and you're still moving.
Yeah, sure. So I was kind of a center of I studied international relations as an undergrad and was kind of interested in politics, but thought I would go work in the State Department or something. I was very much a centrist. And then I got involved in a movement you mentioned earlier, Occupy Wall Street. And I think my timing was just good. I was 19 years old when that happened and kind of went to Occupy and talked to lots of people. And as kind of that movement was a mess in so many ways, now looking back, you almost cringe. But at the time, it completely changed my understanding of what was possible politically and introduced me to the left, which I had no relationship to in the slightest. And so from there, my politics sort of evolved over time, but I really changed my whole kind of career path and interests to pursue what I thought after that experience would be a more effective route for change, which is, movement organizing and socialist politics. So yes, I was not born a socialist, but, I think like a lot of other people, I moved from the center to the left.
And it's interesting that you said you were studying foreign relations. And to me, that's a dubious field there, because like any social science, there's an ideological lens that can sit on top of it. And it kind of, colors everything you kind of see. What did you think when you were studying foreign relations? Well, was that still early on in your college career?
That's what I studied as an undergrad. So I did finish the degree in that. And, it was this massive kind of ideological lens that underlies all of those all of the discussions and the courses. And so it was interesting because Occupy happened during that process. And so my views started getting more critical. And I think studying international relations is like, immediately you start seeing how concerning the United States' role in other countries is. And so I would say that, that criticism wasn't really ever brought up in these classes by anyone. And as soon as I started bringing it up, it became very clear that this would not be a successful field for me. So I think a lot of people who study the U.S.'s role abroad probably maybe would be quite receptive to hearing, if they were involved in the left, they would see quite quickly how one-sided their kind of views are on that.
Yeah, I think particularly whenever I read some of the papers from there, they talk about the global stability or the new world order, the policy of containment. Mm-hmm. Those three are like,
yeah.
Like when I read them back then, they made so much sense and it sounded so logical. But then when I rejected the idea, the city upon a hill, the American exceptionalism, when I reject those ideas, I began to see those specific topics, like those themes that kind of filter through foreign relations. When I started to look at those themes, I started to see them for what they were. And that's why when you said foreign relations, I was like, well, how far did you make it?
Yeah, I mean, I made it. It is a very weird start for a socialist organizer in that I did graduate top of my class from a school that churns out people for the State Department. And I, just rejected any of that kind of career path that I, would have been what I was going down. And I'm very thankful for that because I'm sure I would have, done it my whole life without ever thinking about what I was doing. Because that's how I felt about it as when I was studying it in college.
I'm unbelievably shocked. Like I can't express to my audience enough that when she said she was studying foreign relations, I was like, whoa, how did she come to this? And I think that foreign relations, to me, it's very rare that you see somebody that's really into international relations that even has a leftward tinge, because it's very, very, I said, ideologically colored.
Yeah.
So it really kind of cuts off a lot of the dialogue. The last thing I want to ask you about is you mentioned that oh shoot. Wow. I just had a brain fart right there. Okay. Well, my mind's already drawn a blank here, so I'm going to go ahead and I want to invite you to basically tell the audience how to read your writings, how to catch some of the work that you're doing, and maybe you have a Twitter handle. Go ahead and give that out to the audience so they can reach out.
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter at ALEX, N as in Natalie, PRESS. So Alex N Press. And I've also run a blog, and it's linked at the Twitter account, so you can follow me there.
Oh man, I'm going to actually have to go peruse that myself. The blog, that'd be very interesting. But Alex, I'm glad that you came to join us. You see, I'm starting to trip over my own words now. It's time to go.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for spending your time with me. Alex, again, thank you for your time for like the 5th time. And we're going to go ahead and close out. And I want everybody to remember, power concedes nothing without demand.